Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here. It is finals time. It is time for the final series, the championship series here at the first big international tournament of the year, First Stand, and I could not be more excited to cover it. These two teams have had very different roads to get here, and obviously they've had to overcome very different challenges to make the finals, but at the end of the day, they both got here, and now it's all down to this one series. Whoever wins here today will be your First Stand 2025 champions, the first ever First Stand champions, presumably a tournament that we're going to do more than just this year. I'm super excited for it. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. Always curious to hear your thoughts and opinions on how you thought this series ended up going and if it lived up to your expectations. If you're curious what my thoughts are on the tournament up until this point, we're going to have a playlist linked up in the iCard with every single game covered throughout the entire tournament. All the way from day one down to the end of the semifinals yesterday, we have covered everything. And so if you're interested in that, check out the playlist. But today, we are going to be covering the finals. It is one series to take all of it home. It's definitely an interesting path, and we'll talk about these two teams. But without further ado, let's get into the content. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in the finals, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a series MVP, a finals MVP, to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Nothing to preview at the end of this, nothing to talk about. This is the final series of the winter split, really, of the First Stand International Tournament. The next time you'll see me on this channel in terms of long-form edited content will be the domestic play for the spring split. So this is it for these two teams. Only one will come out on top. Let's go ahead and see how it ends up going. Of course, this is a finals matchup between the representative from the LCK, the hometown team here in Hanwha Live Esports, and the representative from the LEC in Karmine Corp. And these two teams have taken very different paths to get to this specific location. It is certainly not a similar story for both of them. They are definitely not equally as hot coming into this tournament. HLE have looked basically unstoppable for the entirety of First Stand. They end up overcoming the Gauntlet Challenge in the LCK, and that looked to be their biggest challenge because they come to this tournament and it's just not even been remotely close. They've dropped games here or there. They dropped a game to Corp in the best of 3 in the regular season when they were trolling draft. They dropped a game to Team Liquid in the group stage when they were trolling draft, and you know, that's fine. Like here or there, you can see HLE maybe not taking each game as seriously, but when they're locked in, when they're trying to win, which they did against Top Esports, not only in the semifinals where they obliterated them 3-0, even though they were kind of trolling draft, but also in the group stage, they obliterated CFO at the beginning of the tournament when they still felt they had to come out and prove something. They were absolutely dominating teams, and like I said, they did it again in the semifinals. There's really no reason to believe that they are not heavy favorites coming into this series. I think a lot of people are going to be predicting a 3-0 in this one, and honestly, in terms of the difference between these two teams, I think this is a 3-0 caliber difference in terms of talent between these two teams, and HLE is definitely going to hopefully exert that. Hopefully they're taking this series as seriously as they should be and not dropping random games. But for Corp on the other side, it's basically the complete opposite story. They started off this tournament as miserably as you possibly could. They dropped their first series against Team Liquid, who, as we now know, was the first team eliminated from this tournament. They dropped their second series against CFO, and things are looking like a bit of a disaster for Corp. They're sitting at 0-2, and from that point onwards, they are the heavy favorite to be the first team eliminated, but some lucky breaks end up going their way. CFO ends up being a lot better than they probably were expected to be. And because of that, teams like Top Esports and Team Liquid were doing worse than expected. Both of those teams ended up dropping their series to both CFO and HLE, which meant that Corp was actually in a 3-way tie with all of them, that Team Liquid ends up getting broken down on the bottom. It means they get the 3 seed. So not only were they a team that looked like they were going to be out in the group stage, but they don't even get the number 4 seed. They don't even have to face HLE in the semifinals. They get to face CFO. They end up coming out on top. They almost get reverse swept in that semifinal series. They take the first 2. They drop games 3 and 4, but they are able to bring it home in game number 5. And now, after what looked like it was going to be one of Europe's worst international performances in quite a while, purely from a results perspective, this is the best international performance Europe has had in quite a while. Now, obviously, I'll push back on that narrative. I don't think we should write the entire story around the fact that Corp basically won one best of 5 against CFO to get to the finals, and that means that this tournament is fantastic. I still think there are a lot of negative things to take away from this for Corp, but all of that goes away if they really even take a game or two to off of HLE. They don't even really have to win this series if they can show that a lot of the growth that they've had over the course of this tournament, which is kind of the big takeaway for K-Corp, the growth part of it, if they can show that that's real and that is going to continue moving forward, then that's really all you want to see out of this team. They're not going to win this. Like, I'm not spoiling anything. I'm just saying it would be the biggest upset ever if K-Corp was able to walk out of this series with the win. Like, truly the biggest international upset of all time if K-Corp won this. But like I said, like, the things that are encouraging about them are day 1 and day 2 were awful, and then day 3 was a little better, and then day 4 was a little better, and then day 6, the semifinals, was a little bit better. It feels like they've gotten more comfortable playing internationally, especially for a new org. A lot of these players have no international experience. Players like Vladi and Kalista are very young. Like, it's understandable that they took some time to get rolling, especially because they were the last team to get to Korea here, but HLE are huge favorites for a reason. Like, when you look at the matchup specifically here for the finals, there's not a single lane that you can look at and go, K-Corp should be able to even survive in that lane. Genuinely, the only one I can even imagine would be bot lane, and not because Kalista and Targamas are, like, unreal or have been unreal at this tournament. I think they've been good, but I don't necessarily think they've been amazing even in their wins. It's mostly Viper and Delight can sometimes be a little bit flippy. Viper in particular can sometimes be a little bit flippy, but Zeus has been the best top laner in the world so far, even if Kana has been the best player for K-Corp by far at this tournament on the top side. I don't really see Kana being able to generate gigantic resources or, like, gigantic leads into him. Yike and Vladi at times have been a disaster at this tournament, and Peanut and Zeka are just firing on all cylinders at the current moment. Like, I just don't really see a lot of lanes where K-Corp could even theoretically have an advantage unless HLE ends up trolling draft or trolling the early part of the game, which isn't out of the realm of possibility, but it's kind of on HLE to lose these games rather than it being on K-Corp to win them, which I think is not necessarily a great spot for them to be in. That being said, my prediction in this series yesterday, when I kind of went over the finals and talked about what I expected, was HLE 3-1. I expected K-Corp to randomly be able to take a game because that's just what HLE does, is they throw away a game every once in a while. They're not the most consistent team in the world in terms of, like, winning 100% of their games and beating up on bad teams, but there's no way that K-Corp take more than, you know, one game really in this series. If they do, if they take 2, if this goes to 5, hell, if they win this series, like, again, I would consider that one of the biggest international upsets in a very long time, and that's when we really start to have that conversation about K-Corp being one of the more interesting teams in the world. But until proven otherwise, until we see that HLE is actually, like, beatable in any way by the West, then I have to imagine this is not going to be particularly close. But the only way to know if that's going to be true is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was K-Corp. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. And we're starting to look at something interesting here. Obviously, you don't want to panic or freak out too much over a Game 1 win. I do think it's obviously super important to pick up that Game 1 win. Less so in a best of 5 than in a best of 3, as we've talked about throughout this tournament. But still, only having to win 50% of the rest of the games this series is a pretty massive advantage for K-Corp, not to mention the momentum and the confidence that it builds to know that you can come out and win this game. That being said, like, even though it doesn't look it on paper, like, you see a lot of meta champions on the side of HLE, this is a bit of a troll draft. This is like a I'm way better than you type of draft, and they just weren't really able to get away with that. They tried their best to be able to compete in this game. They did get quite a bit of gold onto Viper. They got quite a bit of gold onto Zeus with a lot of those Rumble ultimates, but there is no pressure, like literally negative pressure in the early and in the mid game for HLE. They're ceding all of that to K-Corp and basically saying, we're either going to beat you in game pressure anyways, even in matchups that aren't supposed to, or you're not going to do enough with that pressure to be able to close us out, and we're going to win every single team fight in the late game. Unfortunately for HLE, that little punt that they took on that draft strategy did not really end up working out for them. They do get punished a lot in the mid game, and honestly, K-Corp do a great job of being able to close out this game and team fight really well in the late game. So credit to them. As per usual, we'll quickly talk about draft. Obviously, the dichotomy is very real here. This is a very greedy draft from HLE because it's all scaling. You don't have a single winning lane here. I think the only one that you could even kind of look at in terms of a winning lane is maybe bot lane, and that's only because of the Alistar, right? Like, theoretically, Alistar's gonna have more prio, but like, Misfortune's gonna completely chunk out Kaisa. It's gonna be very difficult for her to do anything. Talia notoriously crushes Azir. Blind picking Azir on B3 with Talia up, especially considering Vladi plays a lot of Talia, is absolutely ridiculous. Rumble on B1 makes a lot of sense. That champion's incredibly strong right now. I would argue he's the strongest champ in the game, at least on the patch that First Stand is playing on, but Jace is a really good counter pick, and Kana has been the best and most consistent Jace, not only at this tournament, but arguably in the world. So far this year, he's been really good on that champ. You're accentuating that with things like Maokai that can facilitate both the Jace and the Taliyah in terms of skirmishing in the mid game, but also kind of give you an out in the late game because his frontline and CC ability is obviously so excellent. You have Misfortune and Rakan as a lane that you can play through for a lot of these skirmishes to take advantage of the fact that HLE can't really fight over a lot of these objectives. Overall, it's just a good draft from K-Corp. It's a really good response draft when HLE is blind picking a lot of these more risky picks, a lot of these more exploitable picks. K-Corp said, okay, sure, we're gonna exploit them in draft, and they got away with it. So obviously credit to them, but they still had to go out and execute. If you're going to pick the kind of draft that's like, well, we play around Taliyah, Jace, Misfortune, and hope and pray that we have a gold lead going into the late game, then you have to be able to get that gold lead, because if HLE stays neutral at all throughout this game, I think it's basically unwinnable for K-Corp with how the front to back ends up looking for them. For K-Corp, though, when you're looking at players that really ended up, I don't want to say overperforming, but looking so good in game number 1, the first one that comes to mind for me is Kalist in the AD carry role on this Misfortune. Really great MF game, a ton of damage. I really still get on Reddit. Like, I'm still one of those people who, like, is going to complain about Reddit every chance that I get. They hate Misfortune. They hate Jim. Those champions have been so useful throughout this tournament because they're just so splashable in basically any comp. Both of them, I mean, Jin more specifically can do basically anything in the game, can play through early laning phases, has a good 2v2, is useful in team fights, has a ton of utility. But Misfortune is probably the most consistent skirmisher out of the AD carry role. I mean, her, Varus, and Ezreal are certainly the 3 that you would consider there, but Bullet Time is just always going to be useful, and she has early game combat power. It's a really nice combination to have. She might not have the most damage in the world. She's not a hyper carry or anything like that, but if you utilize her correctly, she can obliterate fights, and that's what Kalist was doing throughout this game. His positioning was really excellent, and the damage was just absolutely absurd. Really great setup, though, throughout the entirety of this game. Targamas was really good on the Rakan. We talked about how important it was that Targamas needed to step up in this series, not only because Delight has probably been the best support in the world so far in 2025, but because Targamas was so good domestically, and a big reason why this team won the LEC in the first place. If Kalist and Targamas were going to be by far the weaker bot lane of these two, I think this series was going to be rather unwinnable, but if they're going to step up and play as well as they did here in game number 1, that all of a sudden opens up a lot more doors for them, which I think is super important. The other player who I thought was really excellent here, who might not get the, I guess, reward that he deserves, the praise that he deserves for how good of a game he had, was Kana on the top side, and most of that's just because of the scoreline. The KDA doesn't look all that sexy, like the 1-3 and 16 KDA for the Jace, but he was once again incredible on this champion. Quite frankly, HLE was selfish to give that over. Like, there's no excuse for giving K-Corp Jace at this point. He is simply too good at that champion. He has been the best Jace in the world. I think teams either need to pick that away and take it away from Fearless, or ban it in basically every game, because it's just not something you can allow Kana to have at this point. He has found too much success on the champion, and this kind of pseudo turns into a poke comp because you have the bullet time, because you have Jace, and really Taliyah can kind of separate a lot of these things. If you have that gold league, you can basically stake out in a lot of objective areas and make it very difficult for anybody on HLE to actually go for that full engage with the Wukong and Alistar that they want to go for. Maokai just makes things a lot more stable, and Vladi did a good job of expressing a lot of Taliyah's advantages against Azir in the mid lane. It just was a good game from K-Corp. They executed on their draft really well. They got ahead and they were able to close it out. And then for HLE on the other side, I'm not going to criticize them too hard because I still honestly think they played better than they had any right to in this game considering the draft, but like, this draft is troll. I know we've seen some Zed and Kale and Vladimir and Quinn from this team before, which feels more like a troll draft, but this is arguably more of a troll draft because you just have absolutely nothing to do in the early game. There is not a single lane here that is ever going to have priority. Wukong can't really do anything into Maokai in the early game. Like, there's just no way for HLE to ever control the tempo of this game, and even then, they still were in positions where they were winning skirmishes and winning fights. I think that's encouraging for them moving forward, but I doubt they make this mistake twice, especially with champions like Rumble and Azir and Kai'Sa all off the board now. Dead of the game for me is going to go to Delight on the Alistar. Those engages were just very disconnected. They felt very desperate by the end of the game, and Delight was often the one paying the price for it. I'm not blaming him too much. I do think, obviously, at some point, you're just Alistar, and you're going to die a lot more than the rest of your team because you're the only one going in, but he was getting caught out, I would say, proportionally a lot more than the rest of the team. I think you could say similar things about Zeus in the back half of this game. He can be really aggressive and really risky on champions like Rumble. Most of the time it ends up working out because he's really good, but when it doesn't, it looks kind of bad. He still was able to do a lot of damage, so I can't criticize him too much. Peanut wasn't great this game. Like, Zeka and Viper were fine. Viper was pretty good on the Kaisa, but outside of that, like, HLE just had a hard time being able to get themselves back into this game after the draft. I would be surprised if they draft like this again, and quite frankly, even though they're down 1-0, I still think that they are favorites to win the rest of the games in this series. Talk about LEC, like, trends. I believe it was all of 2024 where the finals ended up going loser takes game number 1 and then winner takes all 3 of 2, 3, and 4. I could be wrong about that. I think one of those could have been a reverse sweep by G2 onto Fnatic. But what I'm trying to say is that game 1 for LEC teams, not exactly the most consistent series win rate for them historically. We actually memed about it a lot on the channel last year. K-Corp has to be able to keep the pressure up. That being said, if they win game 2, if they start this series 2-0 and HLE have to win 3 in a row, that's when it starts to be like, oh god, they are actually probably going to win this series. After one game, I'm not willing to completely plant the flag, just because it's so hard to imagine that HLE drop even like 2 of 4 games against K-Corp, but they definitely need to step on the gas now. If they don't win game number 2, things become a lot spicier. So, are they going to be able to pick up the win and tie up the series, or is K-Corp going to get that magical 2-0 series lead and make things the most interesting they've been all series long? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up this series at 1 apiece, and I unfortunately think K-Corp might have awoken a sleeping beast here, because this was not a good game number 2 for them. This was an unbelievably good game number 2 for HLE, and I think when you're looking at this series as a whole, this is more of what I expected from these two teams, and that is a concerning trend for K-Corp. Maybe that game number 1 was definitely a bit of an outlier. HLE still drafting for scaling for the most part, still drafting for the late game. I do think that's still the most consistent part of their draft. They are still giving over some priority in a couple of lanes, in my opinion, which is something that I don't think I'm hearing a lot of people talk about. Reddit kind of blasted out there, oh, 3 losing lanes for K-Corp. I just can't really get behind that at all. I don't really know how you call Aatrox into Gnar a losing matchup. I don't know at all how you call Ezreal into Varus a losing matchup in the bot lane. Like, yes, the R5 Hwei, not a good pick this game. Aurora absolutely obliterates Hwei. I really don't even understand why you would go for that champion in the first place in this instance, but Vladi, once again, just not really making the best decisions at this tournament, as has been kind of standard. Mid laners in general have had really weird draft decisions at this tournament. I'm not blaming the players themselves. Obviously, you know, the coaches and the team just in general is probably a big part of why these champions are getting picked, but mid lane picks at this tournament have been very odd. A lot of people counterpicking themselves and getting really punished for it at this tournament, and it happened once again here, but mostly leaving up the Skarner on B1 for Peanut was definitely a mistake, and we'll get into that. But like I said, talking about these two drafts, I do think K-Corp should have more pressure in the early game. Aurora is going to be a very big problem, and Skarner, quite frankly, is also going to be a big problem. Jungle mid will be an issue that K-Corp is going to not really be able to solve in the early game, but outside of that, Aatrox is going to have a lot more priority into Gnar early game. Typically speaking in that matchup, Ezreal has always been kind of considered the counter to Varus, and so picking Varus into Ezreal, not necessarily the ideal matchup there, I would say, for Viper. Pairing that alongside a Braum, who, yes, can play aggro in the early game, but for the most part, the moment like level 3, level 4 ends up coming around Leona, it's just going to have more priority, especially if they want to play elsewhere on the map. And it's not like Ivern can't do things in the early game. Like, there are definitely ways to play out this for K-Corp. If they're able to get a lead in the same way that they were in game number 1, I think the game could theoretically look kind of similar to that. The issue is that you don't have pressure in all lanes. You end up giving so much of it to jungle mid here, to the middle of the map, and that's where HLE really thrives, and that's what really took over this game. Peanut is a very easy choice for player of the game to me. I think some people might give it to Zeka just based off the damage that Aurora was able to do, but the setups coming in from Skarner, unreal kinds of good. Peanut was absolutely diabolical in this game on this champion, and quite frankly, I don't think you can leave it up for him. Skarner was nerfed going into this patch, and a lot of people started to drop Skarner priority because of it, but we have seen that champion still perform at a ridiculously high level at this tournament when allowed to be played by the actual good teams, by teams like Hanwha Life. When Peanut's able to get his hands on Skarner, it can still be a complete game breaker, and that's once again what we saw here. He just was everywhere on the map, affecting everything at every possible moment. 0 kills and player of the game. That's how good Peanut's game was on Skarner here. But Zeka definitely deserves a shout for the Aurora, because he was the other kind of main member of the team that was really pushing them forward. Not to say that Viper and Delight played poor at all. I do not think they did. They had an awesome time in the bot lane. They really took advantage of a lot of those mid-game skirmishes, and that's where you want to see them have a lot of their success. But Peanut and Zeka were from a draft perspective what you wanted to focus on this game, and they did exactly that. They both were absolutely tremendously good. Zeus was good once again on the top side. Again, the Gnar just doesn't have to do anything in the early game as long as he plays relatively passive. Like, he's gonna lose for the most part into Aatrox because of the amount of combat power Aatrox just generally has in that laning phase, but he's gonna scale totally fine. The engages at the end of the game are still gonna be positive. You can play Zeus weak side if you need to, and he kind of was this game. Viper and Delight were really good. Like I said, Delight was really good on the Braum, very aggressive. Love watching him play a lot of these more like supportive supports because I do think he plays them as if they are engaged supports, and I think that is just always really interesting to watch. Viper had really good positioning on the Varus. That champion just does a little bit of everything right now. Overall, it just was a good game from HLE. They were better in every aspect. This was a dominating game. I think it was even worse than whatever stats you're looking at on the screen would indicate right now. I know the gold lead was absolutely astronomical at the end of the game, but like the kill score, it was like only 11-2, you know, Peanut 0-0 and 9, you know, K-Corp, you had like Khalees at 0-1 and 1, Yike at 1-2 and 1. Like, how bad could the game have actually been? Like, this was a stomp. This was a complete rout. It was not close in any aspect, and I hope I can get that across here. And then for K-Corp on the other side, again, I just don't know what's happening in the mid lane. This is a completely unacceptable pick, and quite frankly, he played it poorly as well. Vladi is the easy choice for dead of the game. Vladi has not been good at this tournament. I know that some people disagree with me on that. I don't really know how you can disagree with me on that. He has been not good at all. Him and Yike were obviously the biggest problem at the beginning of this tournament. The middle of the map was just getting absolutely destroyed by Team Liquid and the Oysters. When we were talking about the first couple of days when this team was really underperforming, even though Yike has kind of stepped his game up and gotten a bit more consistent, he still can be pretty feast or famine. I don't think Vladi has been good. They gave him player of the series against CFO. I very much criticize that. I don't even think he was a top 3 player on his team in that series against CFO in the semifinals. And now, once again, he's kind of getting rolled by Zeka, drafting Hui on R5, which is a bad matchup for Hui. Like, I just can't get behind this. I think Vladi has easily been the worst performing member of K-Corp at this entire tournament, and I think that's continuing right now into the finals, where he really let this team down in terms of the performance he had here in Game 2, but it wasn't just him. Like, Yike got completely out-jungled by Peanut in this one. The Ivern just had absolutely zero priority or pressure. Now, part of that is, once again, just not being able to play through the middle of the map because Vladi was so far behind, but Yike has been so successful on this Ivern. This has kind of been their big gotcha pick throughout the entire tournament, and it did not work in the finals when they kind of needed it to. Targamas was definitely a little bit over-eager on some Leona exchanges. Kana could have pushed the top lane matchup a bit harder. Khalees could have pushed the bot lane matchup a bit harder. Like, obviously, there are things you can point out that are mistakes, but at the end of the day, if your mid laner is going to run it in a bad matchup like this, it's going to create so many issues that it's going to be basically impossible for your team to hold any sort of pressure throughout the entire game, and that's what ended up happening. Vladi has to be better than what he was here in game number 2, and so does Yike, quite frankly. Like, jungle mid, they are so important towards the success of this team. They have to be able to generate those early leads, and it didn't happen here. But now the series is all tied up at 1 apiece. You guys know I do believe game 3 to be the most important game in a best of 5. If you're able to take it tied up at 1 apiece, now you're up 2-1, you have all the momentum, and you have side selection for the rest of the series. It's the best place you could possibly be. This is a must-win for K-Corp, and honestly, it's kind of a must-win for HLE. You don't want to drop 2 games of the first 3 to K-Corp. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up for the first time in this series 2-1, and they look utterly dominant. Once again, I don't even think this is a particularly good draft for HLE. I think their mid game looks absolutely atrocious. I don't really get how you ever end up being able to skirmish with this comp unless you are super far ahead, unless Xin Zhao and Silas are all of a sudden just kind of running around the map doing whatever they want. But guess what happened in this game? Xin Zhao and Silas were able to run around the map and do whatever the hell they wanted to do. It's absolutely ridiculous to see just the individual gap that these players have over their opponents on the other side, because without that, I think the series would be a lot more interesting with the way that things are going down. For K-Corp, it's disappointing. I think this draft is totally fine from them, if not very good. I love Jin on B2. I love the Gangplank on B3. I think both of them are in really good spots, but once again, can you spot the lane that I'm going to criticize the draft in? You're right, it's the mid lane. He's picking Victor into Silas. All of this talk about K-Corp scales really well because they've got Victor and Gangplank and Sejuani for the late game. They have really consistent engage with Rel. They can play side lanes if they need to because Gangplank ultimate is really difficult to deal with and Victor can shove wave really quickly. Like, all of those things absolutely exist, but if Silas is allowed to just move around the map wherever he wants, then what's the point? Like, what are you supposed to do to stop that? This is, once again, you counterpicking yourself in lane, putting yourself in a worse position purely because you can. I don't really get it. I don't understand why K-Corp continues to do this in the mid lane, but it's over and over and over again that this continues to happen, especially once Talia has been taken out. In a lot of these series, it doesn't feel like Vladi plays any other champion that wants to do anything other than sit in lane and hope and pray that the enemy mid laner doesn't stay active on the map. It's actually ridiculous. So I guess we'll get into the strengths and weaknesses of the drafts. I think K-Corp's draft is just straight up better. I think if they had a better mid lane matchup, I would consider this to be just a complete draft gap in favor of K-Corp, because I think the gangplank on the top side is fantastic. HLE basically feel like they have to take the Jax away after seeing the Sejuani on B1 to not allow the Sejuani plus Jax for the top side of the map, and then obviously they end up selecting the Ashe as well. And that's another counter pick that K-Corp can just kind of throw in there, because Jhin is incredibly good into Ashe. This has always been the best, like, Ashe counter, quote-unquote, because Jin's utility is able to match Ashe, and he's basically a bit more consistent of a carry in the current meta than someone like Ashe is. The laning phase certainly is slightly favored in his direction, and I think K-Corp's draft scales better. So you're looking at a top lane matchup that already is favored for K-Corp, a bot lane matchup that's probably favored for K-Corp, and I think you scale, and HLE don't have a good mid game. Like, they do not have a comp that should be able to skirmish really all that consistently around a lot of these objectives, yet HLE are able to dominate basically every single fight and every single skirmish that ends up happening in this game purely off of just raw mechanical ability. When you're looking at the strength of this HLE draft, you're specifically looking at Sylas. Like, Sylas has to win this game. There is no one else here that can do enough to be able to really take over this game. Jax has not been a particularly successful pick in pro so far this year, and teams continue to try and go towards him to hope and pray that he ends up working out, but it's a very low success rate of him being able to carry games. You have something like Ashe Set, which is crazy, by the way, the R5 Set support in the bot lane for Delight. Obviously, he's played this champion before, but this is a really weird time to end up picking Set. Kind of worked out, kind of didn't. The set wasn't really all that relevant throughout a lot of this game, but it once again was jungle mid that just is so much better than their opposition on the other side that the game just blows wide open. Peanut obviously is going to have priority here, at least a little bit in the early game on Xin Zhao playing into Sejuani. He should be able to control a lot of the jungle tempo, but because there aren't that many winning lanes, because it really just is mid lane, a lot of his direction is kind of funneled and forced into one specific area. The unfortunate thing for K-Corp is that one area was basically unstoppable. Every time Zeka was on screen or ran into anybody on the side of KC, they were dead instantly. He was absolutely obliterating people. Zeka is obviously player of the game here for game number 3. I don't have to think about this at all. He already was an absolute menace on the Aurora in game number 2. To see him do it once again on Sylas, especially because it's one of his best champions, it's just ridiculous that you would allow this matchup to exist in the first place, but Zeka continues to look amazing. What a shock. Zeka looks good in the finals of a major international tournament. Tell me if you've heard that story before. This guy steps up when it matters the most, and he continues to do that here. Peanut was also great. I mean, 8-0-11 on the Xin Zhao. This is still a ridiculous performance. It's not quite the 16-1-16 Vi game that he had in the semifinals against Top Esports, but it's still pretty damn good. It's just the mid jungle is so much better than the opposition. That really is the end of the story, and Yike's not even playing all that bad on the other side. Peanut is just in incredible form. Zeka is maybe the single best player at the entire tournament right now. Him and Zeus have kind of been fighting it out for that the entire way through. Even Peanut has been in that conversation, but it's just ridiculous how good this mid jungle has been, and they're really pushing them over the top. Like, Viper and Delight were good. Zeus was fine on the top side into the losing matchup, was able to kind of stabilize that Jax situation, but it all really is about the Xin Zhao and the Sylas this game. And for K-Corp, it's all really about the victor for me. Vladi's going to get out of the game once again. There are going to be people in the comments that say I'm too hard on Vladi. I absolutely expect that to happen. There are a lot of people that are big fans of Vladi, me included. He was good domestically, and I was really starting to get hyped up as to what he could be in terms of a consistent force, but I don't want to mince my words. I don't want it to be misinterpreted. I think he has been awful at first stand. Like, I truly think he's been a bottom 2, bottom 3 player at the whole tournament, including all of the other teams, like including Top Esports, including Team Liquid. Like, Vladi is just not performing well internationally. Again, the player comparison that I gave Vladi domestically, some people didn't really like all that much, but it's the one I'm going to continue to give him. It feels very like 2021, 2022 Larson. Like, he's a very similar player to that version of Larson where, yes, he can perform really well in specific circumstances, and his floor is just so incredibly high because his skill set is so translatable basically to any comp. But when he goes up against the best mid laners in the world, these guys who are ridiculously mechanically talented, like, I just don't know if he's ever going to have the raw mechanical skill to be able to match those guys, and at least at this tournament, it definitely feels like that is starting to turn into the case. Obviously, we don't know if that's going to be the case long-term for Vladi, but I'm just so disappointed with what he has been at this tournament so far. You could also criticize everybody else on this team for this game, though. Kana ends up in a really good matchup on the Gangplank and does basically nothing with it. Yike ends up being the most active player in the game by a large margin, but how much of that was positive? It's kind of up to you to determine. Targamas ended up kind of running it down at the end of that game. Khalees couldn't do anything on the Jhin, which is already a good matchup. Like, it's not like you're pointing to everybody else on KC and being like, oh, they're being held back by Vladi in the mid lane. That's not the point I'm trying to make. I just kind of really want to make the point that I honestly don't think Vladi is getting enough criticism for how bad he's been at this tournament. I truly think this tape has been horrendous, and hopefully he's going to be able to turn it around, but it doesn't feel like that's going to be possible. Zeka is leaps and bounds better than him, and that has become very, very clear in terms of basically every matchup that they've played, and he's picking himself into bad matchups. It just kind of is what it is. If K-Corp can pick up another win here, send it to game number 5, obviously that's pretty gigantic for them. Anybody can win a Silver Scrapes game number 5, but it's certainly not trending in that direction. Is HLE going to be able to close this out in 4, or is K-Corp still going to be able to keep their hopes alive, keep the series alive, and maybe shock the world by taking a second game off of HLE? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to take this series 3-1, and they will be your 2025 First Stand champions, the first international champions of the 2025 season. The LCK takes home yet another trophy, and Hanwha Life picks up an international trophy, which is incredibly important because you have to remember this is the first international trophy ever for this organization. This org has never won internationally before, and for some of these players, this is their first international trophy. This is Delight's first international trophy ever. This is a really big accomplishment for HLE and for these players, and I know First Stand kind of felt more like a formality than anything else, and even this finals, like, game number 1 was cool. I'm glad K-Corp came out and was able to pick up a game, but games 2, 3, and 4 were absolute slaughters. Neither of these games, none of these games were close in any capacity. It never even felt like it was going to be on the table for K-Corp to be able to pick up yet another win after they awoke the beast of HLE in that game number 1, but you still have to give a lot of credit. Like, despite the fact that it was a relatively easy road, HLE ends up going undefeated in terms of best of series at this tournament. They only dropped 3 games across the entire tournament, and they pick up their first international win. This is an accomplishment. This is a big win for this team, and you do want to give them credit in that regard. For K-Corp, the fact that they were in the finals at all is already an accomplishment, again, considering how things have gone, and considering this is their first ever international tournament as well as an organization. Vladi and Khalees, while they may have not been great at this tournament, and I may be very critical of their individual performances, like, this is their first time ever playing internationally, and so you do want to cut them at least a little bit of slack. You know, Targamas hasn't been here in quite a while. You know, Kana and Yike definitely have quite a bit of experience, but this was a team that I don't think anybody expected to be in the finals of this tournament, and yet here they were winning a game off of HLE in game number 1. They won 2 games off of HLE at this tournament, if you include the group stage, and so it's not all bad for K-Corp at all, but for HLE, it just continues to be an absolutely dominant and absolutely fantastic start to the year. Everything you could have hoped for from them is kind of happening right now. So we can go ahead and go over the draft here. Vi plus Ari on Peanut and Zeka. Yeah, they're going to be able to have a lot of pressure in the middle of the map. But I do want to say I kind of get the idea for K-Corp here. I just think that it's a little too late. Like, you need to be the better team in order to execute this. I really don't like the Galio once again in the mid lane, even if I think that that's an okay laning phase this time around, like in terms of the 1v1 against Ari. I think it does fine. I just don't think it necessarily fits into the overall composition, but the moment I saw Pantheon Draven R1, R2, I'm like, oh yeah, they're gonna get slaughtered in this game. I just don't think they have the talent to be able to make this work in the way that they probably want to. Another thing for HLE that I think is interesting about this draft is I think that they maybe either forgot to swap or just didn't swap top lane and support. I assumed when I saw the Gragas on B5 that it was like, oh, this is really smart. You can take the Gragas and play it into Kennen because that's a really good matchup for Gragas, and Camille can go support to try and punish the Draven. That doesn't end up happening. You end up sending the Gragas into the bot lane to try and punish the Draven itself with, you know, body slam on top of the Draven axe, which I do kind of understand, and then Camille ends up going top lane, but I think that is just a worse matchup top lane, and I do think Camille can punish Draven in a very similar way down in the bot lane, so I was a little bit confused by that decision. It felt like pretty obvious to me that Zeus would be taking the Gragas and Delight would be taking the Camille, but at the end of the day, they don't end up swapping. They send Delight onto the Gragas in the bot lane, and it does end up working out because Delight is going to get my player of the game for game number 4. Didn't really have to think about this. He played awesome on the Gragas. This was one of the best Gragas games we've seen. Again, we've seen quite a few really good ones over the course of this tournament, but, support Gragas, not exactly the most popular pick in the entire universe, and Delight still made it look incredibly strong. Viper was kind of the main primary damage carry this game, which they did kind of need. When you're looking at this comp, they do outscale K-Corp, and I do think they have a lot more options, especially the later this game ends up going, because you're playing against Pantheon, Draven. If they're not super fed, it's just kind of doomed for them, but there is a world where it's kind of difficult for them to be able to get on the board in this game, because I don't think they have a ton of big lane priority. I think Kennen actually should have quite a bit in the top lane into the Camille. I think that's a good pick for Kana. I think Draven, theoretically should have more priority, especially with the Renata in that bot lane 2v2, even if I don't think Galio is necessarily going to be able to, roam around the map in the same kind of way Ahri and Vi would be able to, if only just because those two as a duo are very difficult to deal with, and the players obviously have shown a pretty big gap. It's not out of the realm of possibility for K-Corp to be able to win early, but Delight very much neutralized that bot lane 2v2, and then basically the rest of the game was out of control for HLE. He's getting that player of the game, but player of the series, finals MVP to me is very obvious. It's basically got to go to Zeka in the mid lane. Yet another finals MVP to give him and to add to his resume. This guy's just absolutely ridiculous. Every single time he plays in a high-profile finals series, he plays the best league that he could possibly play. The difference between Zeka and Vladi in this series was absolutely ginormous. Not as much here in game number 4, but that's mostly because Zeka was on more of a champion that wanted to play with the rest of the team rather than someone that could take over by themselves like the Sylas or the Aurora could. Not that Ahri can't do those things, just that, it was kind of his role to play more for Viper and Zeus in this game than it was to play for his own leads, but he still was exceptionally good across this series. Zeka is making an argument to be the best mid laner in the world right now. Certainly an argument to be a top 5 player in the world at the current moment, and you're just really excited about that. I considered Peanut for player of the series as well because the jungle gap was also pretty ginormous, but I ended up favoring Zeka a little bit. That's not to take anything away from Peanut. He was really good. Viper had the best game of the entire series that he played here in game number 4. Zeus probably had his best game of the entire series here in game number 4. You can point to a lot of different areas for Hanwha Life in a very positive way, but that's just how good they were across the back half of this series. The final 3 games were just not even remotely close, and that's what you get with a first stand champion. But for K-Corp, again, I think really the takeaway is just congrats on making it here. Congrats on taking a game in game number 1. I know that feels a bit more of like a participation trophy type of thing, but you were never going to be able to compete with HLE. I don't think anybody at this tournament was ever going to be able to compete with HLE. It just kind of is the reality of the situation right now, and you did get slaughtered in the back half here. Draven's dud of the game, like Kalista's dud of the game. The Draven's not looked good for K-Corp throughout this entire tournament. Every time they brought it out, it's not necessarily paid off for them, but I do get the gumption of saying, let's go ahead and try to just snowball the game out of control. Our one hope is that Pantheon, Draven, Renata ends up being so strong in the early game that they don't really have the ability to come back. We just get too big of a gold lead and just kind of snowball it out of control because they understand that from a neutral perspective, they're just not going to be able to win these games. And, they're right in that assumption. So I get the idea. I just think it's not going to work out here. Yike was not particularly good. Definitely outjungled by Peanut, but he wasn't bad. I don't think he was like the Yikes that we got earlier on in the tournament. He wasn't the biggest problem on this team. Kana was not the best version of himself. Obviously it's a big challenge to go up against someone like Zeus, but this is another matchup where he should be doing a lot more on the Kennen and just kind of wasn't. Vladi probably had his best game of the series here in game number 4, at least his best game of the losses here in game number 4, but that's only because the Galio was very difficult to take advantage of, and Targamas wasn't really an issue either. Again, I'm not blaming K-Corp for getting absolutely obliterated in the back half of this series. That's kind of what we expected from this team. That was much more the anticipation for what K-Corp could be, and that is just how it ended up playing out. Hopefully this is the kind of experience and confidence they need to go back domestically and continue to dominate the LEC, raise the level of that domestic play, because the fact that the LEC was in an international final in 2025 is already a huge accomplishment, regardless of whether or not it was because the LPL and the LCP ended up throwing when it mattered the most. It's really up to your interpretation whether or not you even want to consider that. So congrats to KC for making it, but HLE was simply too strong. They are simply too good. They are the best team in the world at the current moment, and they proved that by becoming your first stand champions. All right, but that is going to do it for my First Stand Finals overview and analysis video, and that's going to do it for my coverage of First Stand here, the first big international of the year. Congratulations once again to Hanwha Life Esports. They are your champions, and you know what? It's not just a win for HLE. This is, like I said, the first ever organizational win internationally for Hanwha Life, and that goes back to Rox Tigers as well, to Ku Tigers as well, like that entire organization before they became Hanwha Hanwha Life. This is the first international tournament that this storied LCK franchise has been able to lift, and you've just got to be excited. Like, the history of these teams and of these players is absolutely ludicrously good, ridiculously strong. The fact that it took them until 2025 to finally hoist an international trophy is ridiculous, but I'm so happy, so glad that they were finally able to get the job done. Now, the question is, are they going to be able to go back to the LCK domestically and kind of prove that they deserve that? Right now, they feel like the best team in the world, but remember, their biggest challenge was not at First Stand, it was in the LCK, and we could perhaps be seeing the top, 2 or 3 teams in the world all be in one region right now. I think that that's a pretty fair thing to say, but that's going to do it for my coverage. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're going to be going right back into domestic play with the LTA, the LEC, the LCK, and the LPL once their spring splits start up. We'll be posting primers before the start of all of those splits, but we'll also be streaming today. We streamed yesterday. We'll be streaming today as well for the final day of the NACL Open qualifiers. We are the official co-stream for Citadel Gaming, and so if you're interested in maybe talking to me live or talking about First Stand in chat, or even just watching some NACL OQ action, some NACL qualification series, then check out the stream today. We'll be live both here on YouTube, on this channel, and on Twitch. The link to that will be in the description if you prefer to follow on that channel, but come say hi if you are interested, and of course hit subscribe here so you can be notified when all of those other videos do go live as well. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all